If you were here last week, I want you to know I came prepared with cough drops. I'm even going to open them just to get started. If you weren't here last week, you just missed out on that joke. I'm sorry. But some things are for people here in person, I guess. It means your future hasn't been written yet. Your future is whatever you make it. So make it a good one. So ends one of the greatest stories ever told. I'm curious if any of you recognize what it's from. That means your future hasn't been written yet. No one's has. Your future is whatever you make it. So make it a good one. You can say it out loud if you do remember. I'm curious. Stop it. It was. It's Back to the Future. I was ready to drag this out a little bit. Oh, that's great. Thank you, Courtney. It was, to be fair, it was rated or ranked number 3 out of 33 trilogies all time. So, and it's not just like some random online poll. It was some critic website that I'm forgetting right now. So yes, that was Doc Brown. He says it at the end of Back to the Future, Part 3. I'm sure many of you know the overarching story of the trilogy, and actually I do want to get a sense of this. How many of you at least have seen one of the Back to the Futures? Oh, yeah. Okay, you can put your hands down. How many of you have seen the second one? It does feel like once you've seen the first, you got to see the second. Let's see then the third. Almost the same. It drops off with each one, but just barely. I just, as a quick tangent, I was preaching on Cuddy Hunk 2 weeks ago, and I was preaching on Super Mario Brothers 3, the Nintendo game. And I asked how many of them had ever played it, and I think it was like 3 people. So then when I got to the end and it was Pokemon Go, there was 1 person. So I am just pleasantly surprised. Different congregation, of course, but still pleasantly surprised. But let me just run through it very quickly for purposes of today's scriptures. Just a very overarching review here. Marty McFly, teenage Michael J. Fox. He meets a scientist, Doc Brown, and accidentally travels back in time from his point in time, 1985, back to 1955, where he encounters young versions of his parents, before then traveling back to the future from that point in time, which was really his original present point in time of 1985. And then you get to the sequel, and they travel back to the future, this time trying to save Marty's kids, landing in 2015, something that some of you might remember celebrating just 11 years ago when we reached that point in time in our own timeline. The final sequel sends them back to the past, this time to 1885, where they wrestle again with the implications of time travel, famously exploring, well, really throughout the whole series, how much the past permanently alters the future. Sans the space-time conundrum, the author of our scripture readings from Luke and Acts this morning, the author is also exploring these possibilities. For him, Luke sets out to share the story of Jesus, and then the story of the disciples after Jesus' life on earth had ended. Instead of traveling in time to alter the past, he uses creative license to retell the stories, showing what the teachings of Jesus look like when they're embodied by his followers. The teachings of Jesus from Luke, the stories that are embodied by his followers in Acts. It seems, perhaps, that Luke's aim is indeed to alter their future behaviors, his audience's future behaviors, by how he retells the past. Over the next few weeks, we're going to look at how these two books favor each other. For example, whether Luke might have wanted us to find seeds of the parable of the Good Samaritan from the Gospel of Luke, sprouting up in the actions of Ananias, who cared for the wounded Saul, someone who himself seemed to embody the spirit of the older brother in the parable of the prodigal son. But this morning, We're zooming in on the openings of both of Luke's books, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, which Phyllis and Kelsey read for us. What do we see? The first words of both books serve as an introduction, a message to its audience, to someone named Theophilus. Some scholars think this was a real person, a patron of sorts, who had hired Luke to write these books. But other scholars, and probably the majority of scholars, think that it's a symbolic name meant to represent any follower of Jesus who hears or reads these stories, because the literal translation of the name Theophilus is something akin to friend or beloved of God. Theo, God. Philos, beloved, friend. It's a message of continuity between the beloved of God in Luke, who's Jesus, and the beloved of God in Acts, the disciples, and Luke's audience decades after the events were supposed to have taken place. Now, the similarities don't end right there with the introductions. There are several more. And these next ones I want to just run through very quickly are just, again, from these first two chapters of each of the books. And they show the connection between the stories and also maybe reveal the intention of the author. So here, we have shepherds in the fields watching over sheep in Luke. And we see the disciples on a mountaintop or a hill in Acts. In Luke, we see angels who appear and then speak to the shepherds who are looking up to the heavens. And the angels are telling them that they have good news of great joy that is for all people. And not for nothing, good news here is the translation of the word gospel. In Acts, angels appear and speak to the disciples who are also looking to heaven, this time as Jesus is departing in the ascension. This Jesus who had just told them moments before that they would be witnesses of this good news for all people, stretching to the ends of the earth. We find in Luke that Joseph and Mary are waiting expectantly for Jesus to be born. They're huddled in an outer room with a manger. We find in Acts the disciples and Mary, the mother of Jesus, waiting expectantly for the Spirit to arrive at Pentecost, huddled together in the upper room. In Luke, Jesus is born in a manger. In Acts, there's a rushing wind and tongues of fire when the Holy Spirit arrives. After Jesus is born in Luke, Mary sings her Magnificat, condemning the unjust and longing for justice for the oppressed. And after the Spirit arrives at Pentecost in Acts, Peter preaches a sermon that speaks about every person having a prophetic voice, speaking truth on behalf of the good news for all people and the oppressed. I'll stop there, but all of these similarities, and even in their differences, are Luke's way, I think, of connecting these monumental narratives together for his audience, who surely knew both of Jesus' life and teachings, and the disciples who were dying of old age or martyrdom in those decades after the events took place. In choosing this literary device, Luke is doing more than simply repeating legendary tales. He's sharing a message. In Jesus' life, in the disciples' lives, in Paul's life, in the lives of all of those who convert to the way of Jesus throughout the stories, the message is this, that God is being born again and again in them. And that this is remarkably good news of great joy for all people. One of the reasons the Back to the Future trilogy is so highly ranked is because of how tightly connected the movies are to each other. You can find seeds of each one within the other. The first one ends on a cliffhanger, though it wasn't meant to lead to a sequel at all. It was supposed to be a standalone film. It was just this effort to pique the audience's imagination at the end of the first movie. But it worked too well, so they had to create a sequel, and the sequel begins right there where the first one left off, Like I said earlier, with Doc returning to 1985 in a tizzy, trying to recruit Marty to join him in the future to save his kids. That sequel, Back to the Future Part 2, then ends with its own cliffhanger in that memorable scene when Marty receives a telegram from Doc, who is accidentally sent back to the past, to 1885. And Marty is there reading this 100-year-old document, the telegram, in the rain. Ooh. It is a good part. It's really So Marty's there in the rain reading this 100-year-old telegram. And he becomes overwhelmed by this good news from the telegram, from Doc, and he starts to sprint back to the car when the confused delivery man just happens to catch his arm and ask him, "Wait, kid, what's this all about?" And Marty exclaims in his Michael J. Fox kind of way, "He's alive! The Doc's alive! He's in the Old West, but he's alive!" And that leads into the third movie, where Marty and Doc are encountering all the challenges of the 1880s, during which Marty ultimately does return to 1985, but he's forced to leave Doc behind in 1885. And this time, the end of the story feels final. Because as Marty returns to 1985, the DeLorean, that time machine, the DeLorean is destroyed. The filmmakers later said they wanted a definitive closure to the DeLorean as a time machine because, as Doc had said earlier in the series, it's brought nothing but trouble. It was, after all, running on a rare and dangerous plutonium, but anyway. Surprisingly, though, both in terms of the story and the craft of storytelling, the movie doesn't actually end right there. There's one more scene that embodies and continues the spirit of Back to the Future perfectly. As Marty and his girlfriend Jennifer walk the ruins of the DeLorean along some train tracks, suddenly, out of nowhere, like angels in Luke and in Acts, a locomotive appears out of nowhere. On board, what turns out to be a new time-traveling train, are Doc and his family, fresh from the 1880s, and Doc quips, "Marty, this one runs on steam." It's fabulous because while destroying the DeLorean closes the chapter of Marty's time travel exploits, this new arrival opens up the story to Doc's time-traveling adventures. It's the right mix of closure and possibility that invites the audience to imagine for themselves, even to this day, several decades later, what the next chapter of the story is going to be. And it's the same move Luke makes here in his books. He ends the Gospel of Luke with foreshadowing, and essentially a paraphrased version of Marty's words about Doc. He's alive! Jesus is alive! He's not where you'd expect, but he's alive! And notably, Luke doesn't end his second book, Acts, with Peter or Paul dying, even though by the time it was written, everyone would have known the history of their execution at the hands of Nero. But no, Luke ends his sequel with them living, alive, continuing the story. It's the right mixture of closure and possibility, concluding the chapter about the disciples' lives and witness, and inviting the audience to imagine the next chapter of God's story continuing on in their lives and by their witness. Almost as if Luke has a part 3 waiting expectantly on the audience. It's almost as if there's a part 3 waiting expectantly on us today. waiting on us to live and share about the ongoing story of God being born again and again and again in us. Every time we love and serve and seek justice in our world. Waiting expectantly for us to live and share about the ongoing story of God being born again and again and again. Every time we are witnesses to the good news of great joy for all people. Every time we exclaim with our words and our actions, He's alive. Jesus is alive. He's not where you expect, but He's alive. And every time God is born again in us. Every time God's story of love continues on through us. And that brings us all the way back to the beginning of this sermon and Luke's intention, where we ponder again how much the past permanently alters the future. You see, at the end of Back to the Future 3, Marty McFly's girlfriend Jennifer, like any good disciple in the Gospels, asks Doc a question. And it comes after he appears on this time-traveling locomotive. This very last scene. Dr. Brown, I brought this note back from the future and now it's erased. Of course it's erased, Doc says. But what does that mean, she asks. Almost as if Doc is speaking in parables. And he replies, it means your future hasn't been written yet. No one's has. Your future is whatever you make it. So make it a good one. Friends, the next sequel of God's story hasn't been written yet. And the future is whatever we make it to be. I don't know, what do you say? Should we make it a good one? Amen.